Hello everyone. I'm delighted to introduce our guest today, Mark Solms. He is a psychoanalyst and a neuropsychologist. His work is focused on brain mechanisms of dreaming, emotion, motivation, and consciousness. He has written interesting books like Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness, Beyond Evolutionary Psychology, and The Feeling Brain. With that, I welcome you all and I welcome Mark Solms for today's discussion.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, so when we think of consciousness, which is something so complex, it takes a courage to get that motivation to work on that sort of topic. How did you get that courage to start working on something like this?
Well, let me say, first of all, that it required more courage when I first started in the 1980s than it does today. It was an entirely disreputable topic in the 1980s. It was not the sort of thing you should be studying if you're a serious scientist. But things have changed. In the 1990s, thanks to the work of Jaak Panksepp and the work of Antonio Damasio, I think them more than any others, that they drew the attention of neuroscience seriously to this topic. And nowadays, in the 21st century, there are lots of serious mainstream scientists working on it. But when you ask me, how did I get the courage in the 1980s, which was necessary those days, it was because the reason I came into this field I think the reason I came into this field was because I experienced in my childhood the consequences of my older brother, suffering a brain injury. And I saw him changing from being one person to being another person. And I understood, even as a child, it was easy to have it explained to me that this was due to the damage to his brain. And so I think I was confronted at an early age with the fact that somehow we, our being, our personalities, our selves, somehow they're bound up with the functioning of this organ. And so I was full of a sense of mystery and wonder and disturbance when I started to seriously study these questions. I expected to discover from neuropsychology, which is that branch of neuroscience which deals with mind-brain relationships, I expected to get some answers to how can it be that I and my brother and all of us are simultaneously an experiencing person and a bodily organ. I was expecting to learn something about how these things relate to each other and how it comes about that this physical thing has experiences. But because it was not a respectable topic those days, I was very frustrated and disappointed by what I found, what I learned. And when I asked questions about, but how does it happen that the brain actually experiences these things, I was learning about the functions of perception and memory and so on. But when I asked questions about how do these functional mechanisms turn into experiences, I was kindly advised not to ask such questions, that it's bad for your career. But if you think about what it is that motivated me to come into the field, I wasn't seeking a career. I was seeking answers to profound questions. And so if you call it courage, it came from a refusal to let go of the naive concerns that brought me into the field in the first place. And then, as I say, fortunately, the field changed. So it became increasingly possible to pursue such topics.
Right. I mean, I think, of course, that it was the contribution of people like you that that completely changed the mindset of the people. And now in 21st century, every person is talking about consciousness. With artificial intelligence, it's quite at an ease that people, they want to work on a topic like this. But so you basically started working with sleep first to understand the mechanism of dreams, right? Um, so did you know at that time that you want to work on consciousness, or you uh, sort of want to aim for that, or it was something different that because of course this is one switch which everyone experiences in their routine daily life, right? That they go to sleep and they can experience this thing that their consciousness at least is gone. They have certain like vague memory of those experiences, right? So how did you decide to work on dreams and sleep?
Well, it actually started with sleep. The reason I started, why I focused on sleep, was because it was the one aspect of consciousness that was a respectable topic. In the 1980s, the question of sleep and wakefulness and what the brain mechanisms are, whereby we wake up and whereby we go to sleep. This was a topic that, for complicated historical reasons, had found its way into neuroscience. So I focused on sleep and waking for that reason, but I also took it as an opportunity, as a sort of a license to go one step further and inquire into the brain mechanisms of dreaming, because dreams are a very interesting paradox in relation to the brain mechanisms of sleep and wakefulness. Because dreaming, of course, its defining feature is that it's conscious, and yet it happens while you're asleep. So there's this interruption into the unconsciousness of sleep, of these episodes of consciousness. So I took the opportunity presented by sleep science, the respectability of the topic of the brain mechanisms of sleep and waking. I took it as a window into asking this further question: how come wakefulness appears in the middle of sleep? And that led me, as I learned something of, well, as I learned a lot about the brain mechanisms of dreaming, how dreams come about, that led me to an interest in the brain mechanisms of affect, of feeling, because it turns out that the brain mechanisms that generate affect are centrally involved in the generating of dreams. So that was the sequence, from sleep to dreams to affect.
Yes, and you also found a relation between sleep and the brainstem, that a specific region is important, or was it already described by other people?
Yes, so we had discovered, when I say we, I mean neuroscience had discovered already in the early 1950s that REM sleep was discovered, rapid eye movement sleep. And by 1965, it was Azarinsky and Kleitman who discovered REM sleep. It was Dennett, their colleague, who discovered that dreams happen during REM sleep. That was in 1955. By 1965, Michel Jouvet had identified that it was in the brain stem that REM sleep was generated. By 1975, Alan Hobson had worked out the basic mechanisms in the brain stem whereby REM sleep was generated. So all of that was known. We knew that REM sleep, which is the period of sleep when most dreams occur, we knew all of that by 1975 was located in the brain stem, and in particular in a part of the brain stem called the pons. But what I found my study, I did a very large study on hundreds of patients. Most of the work had been done on cats and on rats to discover the brain mechanisms of REM sleep. The problem with cats and rats is they don't speak, so you can't ask them about their experiences. So we had discovered all of the things I just summarized for you in those species. But I started my study in 1985, collecting a large sample of human patients in whom damage to the brain had affected various aspects of dreaming. And the big surprise was that I found that patients with damage to the part of the brainstem that generate REM sleep, that those patients continue to dream. So that means that REM sleep and dreaming are not the same thing. They happen simultaneously, they correlate, but they are not identical. More interesting than that was that I found another part of the brain, which when damaged leads to a loss of dreaming with preservation of REM sleep. So we call that a double dissociation of function. If damage to area A leads to loss of function A, but preservation of function B, and damage to area B leads to loss of function B and preservation of function A, that means function A and function B are two different things. The part of the brain which, when damaged, leads to a loss of dreaming also arises from the brainstem, but not from the same area as REM sleep. I'm sorry to be technical, but REM sleep is generated by cholinergic cells, that is cells which release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and that part of the brainstem is called the mesopontine tegmentum. A good couple of centimeters in front of and above that is the ventral tegmental area, and that's where the source cells are for the circuit that generates dreaming. And that the command neurotransmitter of that circuit is dopamine, not acetylcholine. And dopamine, as you may or may not know, has everything to do with motivation. So that was a very interesting finding, that the part of one of the major motivational centers of the brain is what generates dreaming. One of the main emotional and motivational circuits. And that, as I said, is what led me my interest. You know, neuropsychologists don't study the brainstem; they study the cortex. The cortex is considered to be the organ of the mind, and the brainstem is thought of as mindless. So it was terribly interesting to me to be directed via this discovery, to be directed to the brainstem, and to be directed to this motivational, the role of this emotional motivational circuit in mental life.
Right. Basically, why I wanted to talk about your work on sleep is because that also outlines your interest in psychoanatomical work that you further continued, and which basically you also explain that once you start removing parts of the brain, what happens to the consciousness of different people. The question here is, so you started also working on this, or your interest on psycho as a psychoanalyst, right? This happened after working with sleep and dreams, and you saw that something is missing there. So what was that?
Sorry, there was a bit of an interruption there. Yes. I became interested in psychoanalysis for two reasons. The one was that when I discovered in that study I was just describing to you, that dreams were motivated by dopamine, were generated by a dopamine circuit, and therefore were emotionally and motivationally driven states. That made me, that sort of was an echo of what Freud had observed from a purely psychological study of dreams, he made the very unlikely claim that dreams were driven by these basic drives, these basic emotional and motivational urges. And so I thought, gosh, maybe he was onto something, because that's exactly what I found from an entirely different methodological point of view. That it is an astonishing fact that in the middle of sleep, this major motivational pathway is switched on like a Christmas tree, and so that intrigued me and made me interested in Freud. The other reason I became interested in psychoanalysis was what I said to you a few minutes earlier, when I said I was so frustrated when I studied neuropsychology by the lack of interest in the actual experiential lived life of the mind. We learned about all of these functional information processing mechanisms, but we learned nothing about why does it feel like something to have a memory or a perception or a cognitive experience of any kind. Now, psychoanalysis, for all of its faults, and psychoanalysis has many drawbacks, it's not by any means a panacea, but what it had in its favor is that its starting point was subjective experience. It used the subjective experience of human beings as its starter, and started from there. So I thought, well, if we can bring something of the terms and concepts and methods that the psychoanalysts had developed for the study of subjectivity and bring that into neuroscience, in other words, offset some of its shortcomings by linking those theoretical claims to methods which are more appropriate for testing claims about the basic functional organization of the mind, then I thought I would simultaneously be able to bring subjectivity into neuroscience and bring a bit of objectivity into psychoanalysis. So that seemed like a pretty obvious way to go. And that's why I trained in psychoanalysis, much to my colleagues' horror. Many of my colleagues were appalled when I told them I'm going to train in psychoanalysis. They said, it's like an astronomer deciding to study astrology.
Exactly. I wonder what Karl Popper would have said once, like if he would know about this, because he was
yeah. Now, the interesting thing about Karl Popper is, he said about psychoanalysis, he said it's not a proper science because it doesn't give rise to falsifiable predictions. And this is exactly the point that I was making a minute ago, is that if you use neuroscientific methods to test psychoanalytic theories, they are eminently falsifiable. They're just not falsifiable by the psychoanalytic method. The psychoanalytic method is a sort of exploratory, heuristic method. It generates hypotheses, but it can't test them experimentally. And let's be fair, also, of course, those days when psychoanalysis was first developed, there were all of these methods we have now, functional neuroimaging, even structural neuroimaging, single cell recordings, even the EEG wasn't available then. There was no physiological method for investigating the organ of the mind in vivo. But now we have all those methods. And so the theoretical claims, like the one I mentioned, Freud claimed that dreams are motivated, wishful states. Well, if that's the case, then, the parts of the brain that we know are involved in motivational and wishful states should be implicated in dreams. And that's exactly what they are. So you get the kind of falsifiability that was undreamt of, if you'll excuse the pun, undreamt of in Freud's day and Popper's day.
Exactly. No, I mean, of course, with the evidence, if you couple the even the subjective experiences, that still makes sense, and that's what we'll discuss now with what came out from your work about the understanding of consciousness. So why don't we directly jump on it and we try to define what is consciousness, and then we try to sort of go and explore your observations about it. So what is consciousness?
Well, let's start with the observation that we are having right now. You and I are conscious and we're busy communicating with each other. I can see you, I can hear you. And this is the obvious place to start in trying to understand consciousness, is to try to understand this stuff that you and I are busy using to converse with each other. Now, I'm saying that because, everyday experience leads us to the conclusion that consciousness is fundamentally about our sensory perception. The consciousness seems to have 5 qualities that correspond to our 5 sensory modalities, that this is the raw ingredients of consciousness, which seems to flow in from the outside. I told you that we discovered in the early 1950s that REM sleep is generated from the brainstem. And that was Azarinsky and Kleitman who discovered that. But in very similar period of time, the late 1940s, early 1950s, 2 other physiologists named Magoon and Maruzzi discovered that if you damage another part of the brain stem, very near to the part that generates REM sleep, that you obliterate consciousness completely. So what Magoon and Maruzzi discovered was that consciousness as a whole is wiped out with damage to a part of the brain that has nothing to do with information coming in from our senses. Information coming in from our senses is sent to the cortex. And if you damage different parts of the cortex, you lose different types of perceptual consciousness. You have impairments of vision or hearing or touch or taste or smell. So it was a very big surprise that Magoon and Maruzzi found that all of that switches off. You go literally into a coma with damage to the brain stem. The way that they explained that was that it was like the power supply. The brain stem was like the power supply to, for example, a television set. So the cortex is like a television set which processes all the information, and then it has to have a power supply, otherwise it can't do anything. And that's how we understood what the brain stem's contribution was. So we spoke of the contents and qualities of consciousness as being cortical, the stuff I was saying earlier, what we see and hear and taste and smell and touch, and that the quantitative level of consciousness, the sort of switching on or the turning up of the volume is what the brainstem does. Now, I told you what I found in my dream study, which I started in the mid-80s and finished in the mid-90s, was that dreaming is driven by a circuit which starts in the brainstem, which is dopaminergic, and which is intensely felt and involved in motivation and mood. If you upregulate dopamine, you create manic states. If you downregulate dopamine, you create sort of adynamic, anergic, anhedonic sort of state, like depression. So why I'm telling you this is that it turns out that the brain stem, which switches on the lights, which is the power supply, does have a quality and a content. The consciousness that's generated from the brainstem generates affect, generates feelings. So although it was reasonable and understandable that we began our definition of consciousness as being perceptual and our localization of it as being cortical, actually subsequent discoveries call that into question, because you only need to damage a tiny little piece of the brainstem, in fact 2 cubic millimeters, is the minimal lesion that's required to obliterate all consciousness. So it clearly can't be to do with perception, and it can't be to do with the cortex. And it's not true that it is simply a power supply, because it generates a quality and a content of consciousness that was not included in our common sense definition. When I said earlier that consciousness has 5 raw ingredients, visual, auditory, somatosensory, gustatory, and olfactory qualities, I left out a 6th quality, which is affect. Affects don't flow in from outside, they come from within. They're not about the outside world, they're about the state of the subject. And so those observations that consciousness is bound up with the brainstem fundamentally, and that the kind of consciousness that's generated from the brainstem, the prerequisite for all other forms of consciousness, all other forms are impossible without the brainstem form, led me to the conclusion that consciousness is fundamentally feeling. And so my answer to your question, I've come about it a very long roundabout way, but my answer to your question is not the common sense one. Consciousness is not fundamentally perception, it's fundamentally affect. And it is not, and I say fundamentally, I mean in its most basic elemental form. It's not about the state of the outside world, it's about the state of the subject of the mind. That our consciousness comes from within, it's ours. It doesn't flow in from outside. And a lot follows from that conclusion. Once you shift the focus away from the cortex and perception and cognition and towards the brain stem and affect and the subject of the body, then consciousness becomes a much more tractable scientific problem.
Yes, fascinating. The only thing is, but before that, for quite a lot of time, the scientific community has thought that consciousness comes from cortex in general, right? But then you had some patients that you could see they lacked different part of cortex, and still they were conscious, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you remember some of those studies. We can also talk about those.
Sure. Well, the important thing is the most striking is not that the patients who lack part of the cortex are conscious. The most striking is that there are patients who have no cortex at all, and they're conscious. So how do you know they're conscious? Well, they respond to their environment with feeling. So, if you frustrate them, they arch their backs and go and you tickle them and they go, and you clap your hands and give them a fright and they go like that. So, these are entirely responsive people. The definition, by the way, of coma is that the patient is unresponsive. In fact, even the definition of the what's called the persistent vegetative state, which is what you would expect if the cortex is the organ of consciousness, in other words, of voluntary activity, then you would expect only reflexes from the brain stem. And this is what we call the vegetative state. In other words, only automatized functions. There's nothing voluntary, there's nothing motivated, there's nothing mental, you would expect. And yet that prediction, to speak of Popper, that prediction is disconfirmed because these patients who have absolutely no cortex are responsive. They're responsive in situationally specific and appropriate ways. Now, the big problem with these patients is because they have no cortex, they can't tell you what it's like to be them. They can't speak. So that's why I, in my book, also reported patients, my observations on patients who have lost huge parts of the cortex, but nevertheless have retained the ability to speak. And I focused in particular on 2 areas. because those are the two areas which cortical theorists claim are where the self resides. Of course, we have vision and hearing and, and all of that, but where does it all come together? Where do I experience my perceptions? And there are two answers to that. The one is the prefrontal cortex, the prefrontal lobes. I had a patient with absolutely no prefrontal lobes, none. And I asked him, are you conscious? And he said, of course I am. And I said, well, my colleagues that won't believe that. So I said, do you mind going through an exercise with me to demonstrate to my colleagues whether you're conscious or not? He said, sure. I said, I want you to picture something in your mind's eye. In other words, conjure up a conscious experience. I want you to imagine that you are seeing 2 dogs and 1 chicken. So he said, okay. I said, are you doing that now? Can you see the 2 dogs and the 1 chicken? He said, yes, I can. So I said to him, well, now tell me, how many legs are there altogether? Count the legs. You see, and this is something you can only do if you've got a mind that's consciously looking at the legs and counting them. Which is also why I gave him an unlikely scenario. How often in life do you count how many legs dogs and chickens have when they're standing together? So I said, can you count them? He said, yes. I said, now tell me how many there are in total, how many legs there are altogether. And he said 8. And I was very disappointed because, of course, the answer is 10, 4 for each dog and 2 for the chicken. So he said 8. And I said, with disappointment, 8? And he said, yes, the dogs ate the chicken. He said, so there you have very good evidence that he's experiencing something. He's picturing this scenario of the dogs and the chicken, and then he goes further to imagine that the dogs eat the chicken. I don't know if he was telling me a joke, but either way, that shows that there's a conscious self there that I was communicating with, even though he has no prefrontal cortex. And then there's the same with the other main cortical area that's claimed to be the seat of the self, and that is the insular cortex. So a colleague of mine, a very famous colleague of mine, Antonio Damasio, he was fortunate enough to make observations on a patient with absolutely no insula, just like my patient with absolutely no prefrontal cortex. His patient, due to viral encephalitis, had no insula. And he made exactly the same sorts of observations that I've just described. The patient said, yes, of course I'm conscious. Yes, of course I experience things. Yes, of course I have a self, and referring to, yes, of course I have a self. There's an I there who's talking. So those observations, coupled with the observations of the patients who have no cortex at all. I mean, these are children who are born with no cortex. They never ever had a cortex. It's a condition called hydranencephaly. You combine those data with the other observation that I mentioned previously, that you damage 2 cubic millimeters of the brainstem and the lights go out. So 2 cubic millimeters of brainstem is all that needs to be removed to remove consciousness. And yet the whole of the cortex can be removed and the patient is still emotionally responsive. The whole of the prefrontal cortex, the whole of the insula, etc. So that's just the lesion evidence. There's other sorts of evidence too. If you stimulate the brainstem nuclei, these are called the reticular activating system, these nuclei, or the periaqueductal gray, which is just behind the reticular activating system and above it. You stimulate these structures, you generate intense affects. The patients, these are people with normal cortex, they tell you, I'm feeling intense fear, I'm feeling intense rage, I'm feeling intense depression, and they act accordingly. So you can generate intense affective states by stimulating those brainstem structures. If you do positron emission tomography, imaging of the brain, when the research participant is in an intense emotional state, joy, fear, rage, sadness, all 4 of those basic emotional states. With positron emission tomography, you look where in the brain is the activity the high metabolic rate of which cells are working to produce this mental state, and they're in the brainstem, in all four of those emotions. And in fact, not in the cortex at all. And by the way, if you stimulate electrically the cortex, you don't get intense emotional states. And so on. You know, there's all different lines of evidence converge on the conclusion that feelings are generated in the brainstem, and that is the basic form of consciousness, because when you remove that type of consciousness, all the other types switch off. You can remove each one or even all of the cortical types of consciousness, you still have a sentient, responsive being there. There's still something it is like to be that patient.
Yes, right. So here we can also talk about, so the thing with psychoanalysis is that till the time we have language, of course, everything is well and good. But then once we go beyond that, so let's say even if the person is in coma, can we say that that person is not conscious? And then, of course, we can also talk about the other species, other animals, right? Because brainstem is something which is also quite conserved in most of the species. So how does that work? Or is it possible, or are you also looking at certain, these regulators like dopamine or something that goes up or down when you stimulate parts of brainstem, and you see that this sort of relates to conscious experience?
Yeah, so look, let's take what you're saying in two parts. The first is the difference between humans and other animals. Humans who can speak can report their states of mind, and that's great, you know. So we start with humans. I've just told you about patients with huge cortical lesions who report on their experience, and they're still there experiencing, and even patients with no cortex appear to be experiencing. But because you can't know, because they can't talk, the patients with no cortex, that's why we use these other methods. We say, okay, well, what happens if you stimulate the brainstem in somebody who can talk? You stimulate intense feelings. What happens if you image the brain in somebody whose cortex is intact? Is the activity when they're in an intense emotional state, is it in the cortex or is it in the brainstem? The answer is it's in the brainstem. And you just mentioned neurotransmitters. If you manipulate neurotransmitters like dopamine, or for that matter, serotonin or noradrenaline, you manipulate emotional states. Dopamine has everything to do with motivation. I was saying earlier, you increase it, you make mania. You decrease it, you make depression. Serotonin, the SSRIs, the mainstream medication for depression, antidepressant medications, they increase serotonin, which is sourced in the reticular activating system. The source cells for serotonin and dopamine are in the reticular activating system. The same applies to noradrenaline, which if you manipulate it, you increase or decrease anxiety. Those cells are also in the reticular activating system. So once you've made these observations in human beings who can speak, that manipulating those chemicals changes their feelings, stimulating those nuclei changes their feelings. When their feelings are changed, you image their brains, the activity is in the brainstem, and so on. So it's pretty reliable evidence. In fact, it's incredibly strong, converging lines of evidence with a multiplicity of different methods that in human beings, the feelings are generated, affects are generated in the brainstem. Now, we can look at other animals that have the same anatomy as us. And as it happens, the brainstem anatomy is extremely ancient. The reticular activating system and periaqueductal gray are basically the same in all vertebrates. You know, all vertebrates, not just all primates or all mammals, all vertebrates. So fishes, for example, have these structures pretty much the same as yours and mine. So now you have the opportunity, again, let's invoke Popper, that you can make falsifiable predictions. You say, I know in a human being, if you stimulate the ventral periaqueductal gray, they love it. They say it's delicious, delightful feelings. And they want you to stimulate it more. You stimulate the dorsal periaqueductal gray, it's the opposite. They hate it. They feel fear and pain. It's terrible. So you can, on the basis of that observation reported by human beings, you can make predictions. If I stimulate the ventral periaqueductal gray in a fish, it will avoid the stimulus. And if I stimulate the dorsal periaqueductal gray in a fish, it will approach the stimulus, and the dorsal periaqueductal gray, it will avoid it. That's my prediction. And then, you see, is my prediction confirmed or falsified? I'll tell you the answer every single time. It's confirmed. Fishes, like all vertebrates that we've studied, the same basic affective responses are found in there from lesioning or stimulating chemically or electrically, or imaging for that matter, their brain stems. They're doing basically the same thing as in us. So although we have more, we have an additional source of data when it comes to humans, namely verbal reports, it's not the only source of data. And that one we forego when it comes to the other animals. But all the other ones which are available, the results of all those other methods, every prediction is confirmed from the hypothesis that consciousness in the form of feelings, affective feelings, is generated in the brainstem in all vertebrates. And therefore, to say the obvious, all vertebrates do have feelings. And that's a shock, especially for those of us who eat them.
Yes, exactly. So the thing is that so about these feelings, most of the times we are not aware of, or we are not basically conscious of most of the activities which are happening around us, right? And how is it different than what we are feeling? So we are aware or conscious of all the feelings that we feel, but not of certain activities.
Well, let's start with the first comment you made. We're not aware of most of what goes on around us. Now, that might be a surprise to some of our listeners. So let me just underscore what you've just said. That is absolutely true. We're not aware of most of what's going on around us. And you can easily demonstrate that. There are review articles I would cite. One review article by Barge and Chartrand, B-A-R-G-H, and Chartrand, C-H-A-R-T-R-A-N-D. They reviewed all the literature. The other review is by John Kihlstrom, K-I-H-L-S-T-R-O-M, K-I-H-L-S-T-R-O-M. Those two papers, the Barge and Chartrand one's title is The Unbearable Automaticity of Being. And the title of Kihlstrom's article is Perception Without Awareness of What is Perceived, Learning Without Awareness of What is Learned. And what those two review articles show us is that, well, in fact, Barge and Chartrand measure it. They say 95% of our cognition is unconscious. 95% of our perception and cognition is unconscious. So, you're aware of 5% of what is actually driving your behavior. And experiments, like I'll just cite one of them. You can flash with a tachistoscope, which gives you just a few milliseconds of an image, so brief that you don't consciously register it. You ask the research participant, did you see that? They say, what? Nothing happened. So, but you're flashing visual information to them. In this experiment, you flash an image of a face A, and underneath that it says something like murderer. And then there's face B, and underneath that face it says something like philanthropist. They don't know they've seen anything. They're not conscious of seeing anything. But then afterwards, you show them those same faces consciously. You say face A, face B, which one do you prefer? And they all prefer face B. So that shows they've received the information, processed it unconsciously. And the information in question here is face recognition and reading. These are cortical processes. So you can read and recognize a face and associate, read with comprehension and associate the word with the face. All of that, the cortex can do all of that without being conscious. So that's the first point, that the cortex, I say again, is not the seat of consciousness. Here's further evidence for it. The cortex can do all of its cognitive gymnastics without being conscious. So why are we looking there for the source of consciousness? It's not an intrinsically conscious business, cortical activity. Now you look to the brainstem. You say feeling. That's a very good word to use, because what is feeling if you don't feel it? I mean, you can have visual information processing. You can see. I mean, there's oodles of evidence. You can see without being conscious of seeing, as I just told you with that reading experiment. You can likewise hear without being conscious of it, etc. All of that cortical information processing can go on unconsciously and does go on unconsciously 95% of the time. But feelings, you can't have a feeling and not feel it. If you're not feeling it, it isn't a feeling. So that's why. I mean, and I'm not just making a semantic point. I'm not saying that if you don't feel it, it's not a feeling. I'm also saying that's what the brainstem generates. The fundamental, and remember, all the cortical consciousness depends upon the brainstem. And the brainstem is generated, the whole function of the reticular activating system is to activate. Its function is to be conscious, to make consciousness. That's what it does. So I think we made a big mistake in the history of neuropsychology when we started trying to understand the brain mechanisms of consciousness. We looked in the wrong place. We focused on the visual cortex. That's been by far the main model example of consciousness is cortical visual processing, and how does it become conscious? I think that we were looking in the wrong place. We should have looked to the brainstem, to the reticular activating system and periaqueductal gray, and we should have looked at feeling as our model example, the basic form of consciousness, in order to understand its mechanism. Why look at a function or a tissue which is not intrinsically conscious for the essential mechanism of consciousness? You've got to look to the reticular activating system, which is its whole business is to generate consciousness. So that's why what you were just saying about most of what we perceive is unconscious. That's true. Most of what we feel, you bet. The best place, the best example of consciousness to study, if you're wanting to understand how it works, is the form that is intrinsically conscious and the form that is a prerequisite for any other form of consciousness. In other words, we should be looking at the fundamental form, and that's feelings.
Yes, I mean, of course, as always, it's an example of the humans being anthropomorphic. Since we have this bigger cortex, so why not to focus there rather than focusing on something which is central to most of the life forms, or at least vertebrates, yes, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you just made. It's anthropocentric, and it's sort of, to start with human consciousness is to assume that consciousness evolved with humans, but surely consciousness, like everything else, it starts out in much simpler forms, and raw feelings like feeling hungry or feeling sleepy or feeling too hot or feeling fear. These sorts of things, there's no reason to believe that you have to have a complicated human cortex to have these forms of consciousness, which are the raw basic natural kinds of consciousness. They evolved long, long, long before humans.
Exactly. So this means that most of the experience that we have is just an information that our senses are collecting. In that case, what will happen in experience deficit means the people who are lacking those experiences, like blind people or deaf people, that they don't have that experience, but still they are conscious of in certain way. So
Yes, well, so that's a good point, that you can be blind and still be there, you can be deaf and still be there, you can be blind and deaf and still be there, etc. And what is it that's still there? It's you. It's the experiencing subject of the mind. You see, what vision and hearing and so on, what they do is they represent objects. They represent objects to the subject of the mind. You can't have any objects of consciousness if there's no subject of consciousness there to perceive them. So it's that sentient subject that we should be focusing on. And the subject of the mind is affective. And what I mean by that is that it is feeling its own state. And feelings, at least the most rudimentary forms of feelings, are all about the state of the body. So the primary source of consciousness is our own bodies and the monitoring of the state of our own bodies. And then secondarily, so we extend that consciousness onto the outside world, so that it goes something like this over two stages. Firstly, I feel this, and then secondly, I feel this about that. And so consciousness is extended onto perception. And that is literally how it works physiologically, that the feelings are generated in the brainstem, which then arouse the cortex. The cortex is able to function without brainstem arousal, but it functions unconsciously. The brainstem arousal of the cortex is literally feeling your way into your cognitions, so that you experience your cognitions, which otherwise go on unconsciously. That is a very simple way of putting it, that the brainstem palpates, as it were, modulates, it arouses, it feels the information processing that goes on in the cortex. And this is how we become conscious of what's going on in our cortex, and thereby of what's going on in the outside world.
Right. Here we can also take the point of Dennett that consciousness is illusion. So would it be fair to say that it's an illusion?
Well, I've had a very interesting debate with Dennett on exactly this point. It will be published maybe next month in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. It may be this month, but it's coming out. I've already corrected the proof, so it's coming out very soon. And where he makes that point. Now, the point being that consciousness is an illusion. So let me just unpack that briefly. People might wonder, what does he mean it's an illusion? What he means is not crazy. What he means is that, consciousness that what we are conscious of are things generated by our own brains. The way in which we represent the world consciously is not the way the world actually is. So let me give a simple example. Wavelengths of light reflecting off surfaces, we perceive them as colors, but they're not, the wavelengths of light and the reflectances of the surfaces are not in themselves colored. There's not something red there or something blue there or something green there. We perceive it. Our brain interprets those particular light dynamics, those wave dynamics. The brain bestows the color red onto that wavelength and blue onto that one and green onto that one. So it's a property, as it were, of the subject. They are subjective qualities. And that's what he means by an illusion. It's that we imagine, oh, the world is red, but it's not. The world is wavelengths of light. And we interpret those spike trains, which is actually all we receive is spike trains from our neurons, and we experience it as red or blue or green or whatever. I'm just using color as an example because that's what so many people do. They focus on vision. So in that sense, I agree with Dan Dennett. Consciousness is an illusion in the sense that it's a virtual reality that we generate in order to interpret the actual reality. We don't have access to reality as it actually is. We only have access to our perceptual representation of it. But now, the same does not apply to affects. You can't say an affect is an illusion. For example, if you feel pain, I can't say to you, you're not really feeling pain, you're not really in pain. It's just your interpretation of something going on, but it's not really pain. Pain is a subjective state. You see, nobody ever claimed that pain is anything other than a subjective state. So we never thought of pain as an object in the world. We thought of pain as our own subjective response to something happening in the world. You can only say the pain is an illusion if you feel your left arm is in pain, but actually nothing has happened to it, like happens with phantom pain. But the illusion there is not the pain. The illusion is what's caused it. So we can speak of consciousness as an illusion when it refers to external objects, which we subjectively experience as conscious, but they're not actually conscious things. They don't have the properties that they have in our consciousness. But subjective states, I don't think you can call them illusions. Like, je tend to think of this. You tell me you're depressed, and I say, no, that's not a real depression. You just have the illusion of being depressed. You tell me, well, okay, it was still the same thing, you know, I'm depressed. Because affects are subjective states. So they can't be illusions. They just are what they are.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's my disagreement with Dan Dennett. It's in a way not so important. I mean, I think I'm more sympathetic with him than he might realize. I really do think that our consciousness of the world belongs to us. It doesn't belong to the world. So in that sense, he's right. It's the state of mind. It's not an actual state of the physical universe around us. It's our subjective representation of the physical universe around us. But when it comes to the subjective interpretation of ourselves, that's the subjective interpretation of the subject. So in that case, it's not an illusion.
Yes, I will read your debate. And also Dan, he said that probably he will come early next year to talk to me. So probably
Good.
then I can
send him my best regards.
Yes, sure. Yeah, so here we can take probably one more question, then some questions from the audience, because I think they have also pile of questions for you. So as you already mentioned about the visual perception of the world, and this is what also Francis Crick did in the late 20th century, which is what then made David Chalmers to make a comment that why doesn't all this information processing go in the dark, free of any inner field? And he labeled it as the hard problem of consciousness. And I think this is where your now work comes, and or your explanation that why consciousness is not so hard problem. So why is that?
Well, it has everything to do with what we've just been talking about over the last hour, namely the difference between perceptual consciousness and affective consciousness. Dave Chalmers's point is when he says, why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? He's actually talking about perception. And it's a very valid question, because as I said to you, as we know, you can perceive without being conscious of perceiving. So why doesn't perceiving go on in the dark without any inner field? The mechanisms whereby perception occurs doesn't require feeling. And so that's his essential point. He's saying that, therefore, the mechanism doesn't explain the experience. So a mechanistic account of cognition, says Chalmers, does not account for why there is something it is like to be a cognitive machine, to be the brain. And I think that argument is entirely valid when it comes to perception, because perception is not intrinsically conscious. But it doesn't apply to feelings, because feelings are intrinsically conscious. You can't say that if you explain the mechanism whereby feelings come about, you will not have explained why they feel like something. I'd say, hang on, if you explain the mechanism whereby feelings come about, you have to explain why they feel like something, because that's the whole function of feeling. It's to feel. The essential function of perception is not to feel. It is to perceive and to process that information, and you can do it unconsciously just as well as you can do it consciously. So I think David Chalmers's hard problem is an entirely valid objection, entirely valid concern about why does it feel like something to perceive if you can perceive without feeling like something. And the mechanisms of how perception works doesn't explain why you have to feel something. Now, I think that's valid, but I don't think it's valid when it comes to affects, precisely for the reasons that I've just said. So I think that the hard problem, the way to solve the hard problem is to look at the right form of consciousness. And I don't mean it arbitrarily. I don't mean cherry picking the form that works best in terms of the argument I've just presented, because I want to remind you that affect is the basic form. It's the oldest form, it's the fundamental form, it's the necessary prerequisite form for all the other forms. And the mechanism of feeling has to explain why it feels like something, and so the hard problem falls away. There's another whole story as to what the mechanism of feeling is. I'll just conclude our discussion by telling you we understand it bloody well. We understand very well what the mechanism of feeling is. And so the hard problem, I think, really I would say it dissolves once you recast it in relation to feeling as opposed to cognition.
Yes. And to understand the mechanism of feeling, I mean, of course, you link it with the survival, with homeostasis.
Yes.
Probably we can talk about it briefly so that also audience will get an idea of how is this mechanism, and then we can go for the questions.
Sure. Well, the most basic difference between living things and non-living things is that we do not dissipate. We resist the second law of thermodynamics. I don't know what the disciplinary background of our audience are, so maybe not everyone is familiar with the second law of thermodynamics, but it's one of the most basic laws, in classical physics, which is that, let me use this example. If you put hot water into a cold bath, the hot water doesn't stay there in a globule under the tap. It dissipates. It evens out with the cold water. That is entropy. That's an example of entropy. Now, living things, they don't dissipate. They stay there like a globule under the hot tap. In other words, you and I, we need to remain within the temperature range 36.5 to 37.5. That's quite hot compared to the ambient surrounds. We can't just even out with, I'm in Berlin at the moment. I think the temperature is about 8. If I allowed my body to equalize with the ambient temperature, I'd be dead. So my body has to work at remaining in its viable range. That's the essential mechanism of homeostasis. Homeostasis is it's the most basic biological mechanism. It's how living things stay alive, that we don't dissipate, we resist entropy, and we work at staying within our viable bounds. So that applies to many, many, many different functions. Respiratory control, digestion, energy balance, blood gas balance, water, salt, all of these things. We constantly have to remain working at remaining within viable bounds. And this works automatically up to a point. And then beyond that point, you feel it. When you're deviating from your homeostatically viable state, it feels unpleasant. And when you return to your homeostatically viable state, it feels pleasant. This applies to all of our different needs. So there's a different quality of unpleasantness, sleepiness, thirst, the need to urinate, the need to defecate, pain, etc. All of these are bad. And then the relief of pain, relief of sleep, relief of hunger, relief of thirst, relief of suffocation, etc., feels good. And what that feeling does is it tells the organism whether what it's doing at the moment is working or not. So that's how what feeling adds to automatic reflexes. Automatic reflexes work automatically, and that's fine, as long as you're in a predictable situation. As soon as you enter a novel or unpredicted situation, you don't know what to do. And that's where feeling kicks in. Feeling drives voluntary action as opposed to automatized action in the way that I've just described. There's a value system. It's good to stay alive. It's bad to die. That value system, we register it in terms of our feelings. And the feelings enable you to make choices beyond reflex. You see, reflex doesn't require choice. An unpredicted situation requires choice. And choices have to be grounded in a value system of what's good and what's bad. And I've just told you what the value system is of all living things. What's good is what keeps you alive. What's bad is what kills you. And feelings register that goodness and badness to the creature and enable it to make voluntary choices in uncertain circumstances. And then, by the way, learn from the experience. And that's more complex forms of how this works. But the basic point is that feelings enable the organism to make choices which enhance its chances of survival hugely over and above what reflex provides. So feeling is an extended form of homeostasis. Now, the mechanism whereby homeostasis works, what I've just described to you, these are my viable bounds. This is an error signal. This is an increasing error signal, a decreasing error signal. And then there's a prediction required as to how to reduce the error signal. Reflexes provide simple predictions. And then learning from experience provides more complex predictions. And so that's not complicated, what I've just said. That's easily reduced to a set of equations. And we've done so. My colleague, Karl formulated a set of equations explaining how homeostasis works. And when I say explaining, I mean reducing the causal mechanism to, this is how it works, always. It's a law. It's called Friston's law, by the way. And then I hooked up with him and said, well, if feeling is an extended form of homeostasis, it must be possible to extend these equations to explain causally the mechanism of feeling. And we did that in a paper published in 2018 in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. The reason we published it in the Journal of Consciousness Studies is because that's where Chalmers published his hard problem in 1995. So in 2018, we published this paper in that same journal. The title of the paper is How and Why Consciousness Arises, Solms and Friston 2018.
Sure, I will add the link in the later in the description. Okay, I have a few more questions, but let's take questions from the audience first. So guys, just raise your hands if you want to ask. And meanwhile, I have some questions in the chat. So one question is from Koala, the person who has the koala. Kavya, does the region responsible for I in the brainstem is active during dream state?
Yes. So the in the dreaming state, I want to draw your attention, first of all, to the fact that, of course, there's not only one center that's active in the dreaming state, but the one that drives it. In other words, the one that, when damaged, leads to a loss of that state. The nucleus is the ventral tegmental area, and there are two pathways arising from that, which are called the mesocortical and mesolimbic dopamine systems. And those two systems are highly activated during dreaming sleep. In fact, they are the most highly active part of the brain during dreaming sleep. But there are other brainstem and limbic regions, and indeed some cortical regions, which are also activated. But the pivotal one, the main thing, is that dopaminergic circuit arising in the ventral tegmental area, and then other limbic structures, then a few cortical structures.
Yeah. Anna?
Yeah, so hi, thank you for the fruitful discussion. I have two questions. So if I understood, like, to be conscious is somehow an assembled somehow state based on like different kind of information. So you use your affect, as you say, your perception, your personal experience, memory, right, to interpret something in an emotional way. So it seems like there is plasticity there. Somehow my question is like, does our consciousness evolve throughout our life? Is a newborn, for example, conscious? Do we start with the basic level or really low level of consciousness, which is somehow then during our life is being involved?
Yeah, so I think that it's helpful in relation to the sort of question that you have in mind, that we differentiate between different levels of consciousness. Firstly, I differentiate between affective consciousness, which is raw feelings, and cognitive consciousness, which is the representation of the objects of those feelings. In other words, I feel like this about that. That's cognitive consciousness. And then cognitive consciousness can itself be further divided into two levels. Usually the terms that are used are phenomenal and reflective consciousness, primary and secondary consciousness. So the one is just having conscious cognitions, and the other one is reflecting upon your having of cognitive cognitions. So it's being aware of what you're aware of. So that's a higher order of, some people call it higher order thought, some people call it access consciousness. There are all sorts of terminologies, but basically the point is there's raw feeling. You can just feel pain. You don't need to know anything about where it's from or what's causing it. It's just a feeling. That's the most basic form of consciousness. Then there's attaching the feeling to a representation. That's cognitive consciousness. And then there's re-representing it, reflecting back upon it. And that is higher order cognitive consciousness. Now, certainly that third form of consciousness doesn't exist in babies, newborns. So that most certainly develops, and it develops in leaps and bounds with the evolution, with the maturation of language, because language is a fantastic vehicle for thinking about your thoughts. In other words, for having abstract categories, so you don't just have like, duh, this is causing pain. It's like, oh, that is a needle. It's causing pain. Needles cause pain because they're sharp, and et cetera, et cetera. All that kind of knowledge we're not born with, and we acquire it. And so most certainly there is a huge amount of plasticity in terms of the cognitive side of consciousness. We must also remember that then you have top-down influences on your affects. So the ability to be able to name your affects and understand where they've come from and what they're about and what you can do about them, makes for a circular causality. It's not only that, raw affect comes first, then these other things get added. These things that get added also have an influence on raw affects. So yes, in all sorts of ways, what you've said is correct. And the simple point is we need to think of levels of, or layers, hierarchy of complexity of types of consciousness. But there's one point, Anna, that I need to end with, which is to remind you that the prerequisite for every form of consciousness is affect. If you take out the affect, everything else falls by the wayside.
And if I can ask you something more. So I understand that, okay, we sense something, so, and then we behave. And the different organisms, like from bacteria to the more complex, they have acquire different strategies, like to survive. Like we know about chemotaxic, phototaxic, the different, like tropism in plants and all this stuff. And all these kind of strategies, they are product of natural selection. Like they have evolved like through natural selection. What is happening with consciousness, however? Is it really a product of natural selection, or is it a byproduct of like this sense? We sense, like for example, in humans, we have the nervous system, we sense, and then we behave. And then like it's a byproduct of those two.
Well,
you understand what I'm saying? Like I can.
Yes, I understand what you're saying. But first of all, let's replace your word sense with feel, because there are a lot of sensory mechanisms that have nothing whatsoever to do with consciousness, even in plants. Even in single cellular organisms, they are sensory mechanisms. I gather from what you were saying earlier that you're a biologist, so you know that. So sensing in the sense of being sensitive tissue and there being response to the stimulation of the sensitive tissue, that I do not believe is the beginning and end of how consciousness works. Consciousness has to do with the creature or the organism sensing its own state in terms of its homeostatic, the categorical variables, and it's important that they're categorical variables of its different needs. Why it's important is because there's not a thing called total need. You can't say, I have 5 out of 10 of hunger and 6 out of 10 of sleepiness. So that means I've got 11 out of 20 of total need. All I need to do is sleep. I don't need to eat. It doesn't work like that. You need to sleep and eat. And I've just mentioned 2. There's a myriad of different categories of need, and they each have to be satisfied in their own right. So each one of those homeostats has to be registered as a category. And categorical variables, unlike continuous variables, are qualitatively differentiated. So the difference between categorical variables is not quantitative, it's qualitative. So we have multiple needs and we sense those, but they're not sensory. It is in fact a homeostatic principle of how I interpret the state of my body in relation to what is viable and what's not viable. That for me is the basic form of consciousness. Now, the question, and to the extent that the answers of how to restore homeostatic balance is obtainable reflexively, in other words, by an automatized algorithm, to that extent, there's no need to feel it. There's just a single overarching complicated algorithm. When this happens, that you do this. When that happens, you do the following. But when you enter into, as I was saying earlier, states of uncertainty, when you can't predict, there is no inbuilt algorithm that enables the organism to survive in a novel environment, which is hugely important. That's where feeling comes in. Now, your question comes down to at what level of complexity of organism does this extension of homeostasis to the organism knowing its own state subjectively, at what level does that kick in? And I can only say that the organism has to have multiple needs, and it has to know how to manage those needs in unpredictable environments, and it needs to make choices. That doesn't apply to plants, by the way. Everything I've just said does not apply to plants. And it's probably got a lot to do with the fact that they're stuck in one place. They have a very predictable world, plants. As soon as you have as soon as you have ambulatory organisms, the world becomes a lot less predictable. So, I'm not saying every ambulatory organism is conscious. I'm just saying, I'm not surprised that plants are probably not conscious. I'm not surprised that there's this distinction between animal and plant life. But within the animal kingdom, I start at the top. In terms of, if you'll forgive me putting humans at the top, I start with what we know, because we ourselves are human. We know we're conscious. Then we can discern what the brain mechanisms are that make us conscious. And they are brain mechanisms, by the way. So then we think, okay, well, let's see what other organisms have brains and what other organisms have brains that have got these reticular activating systems and periaqueductal grays. That takes us all the way down to all vertebrates. That does not mean, and here's the last point I wanted to make, I'm not saying, therefore, only vertebrates are conscious. I'm saying I'm confident that all vertebrates are conscious. I'm less confident when it comes to other, like cephalopods, they make choices. Flies make choices. So I'm perfectly ready to accept that probably cephalopods and insects, probably they're conscious, but the evidence for it, it's much harder we don't have homologs. So it's very hard to make predictions from we don't know what to test really. I'm ready to believe they are, but I'm not so sure that they are. When it comes to other organisms, I'm even less sure.
So basically, if I understood correctly, so behavior, we do agree that it's a product of natural selection.
Yes, yes. Consciousness is a product of natural selection. Sorry, I didn't say that explicitly. Consciousness is a product of natural selection, definitely. Feeling is just another biological function. It's a massive adaptive leap to be able to feel your way through novel problems. And this is why it's selected in. It gives massive adaptive advantages.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, since we were talking about plants, let's see what a plant scientist has to ask. Shretama.
Hello, Mark. It was an interesting discussion. So yeah, I'm a plant scientist, and whenever this thing about consciousness comes up, I'm always curious about plants. So of course, there are many plant scientists themselves who reject the theory of plant consciousness. But I briefly worked on a project that had to do with keen recognition in plants. So that is also in its infancy. So it has been studied that plants, maybe take this scenario in a forest. There is a plant, it's a mother plant, and it has different other plant of the same species maybe around itself. But when it comes to a stress condition, it actually gives away through its root system, gives away its nutrients to its own children. And that has been proved. So do you think this keen recognition in plants is an equivalence of consciousness in animals?
Well, first of all, it's, I really want to emphasize that I am on the side of a liberal attribution of consciousness. I'm the opposite of anthropocentric. My dear friend Jaak Panksepp, his colleagues used to accuse him of being anthropomorphizing when he said that all mammals and probably all vertebrates are conscious. They said you're anthropomorphizing. He said, no, I want to zoomorphize us humans. We are just, we are just living organisms. We're not so special. I take that view. So, unlike most of my neuroscientific colleagues, I say it's most certainly not a uniquely human thing. It is absolutely, definitely all mammals, all vertebrates. Don't be silly. Of course they're conscious. And then I say, I don't know about cephalopods, I don't know about insects, but I give them the benefit of the doubt. You have no idea how far that takes me away from the mainstream. So I'm liberal in the attribution of consciousness. So when you make these comments about plants, I'm going to respond in a way that might sound skeptical, but I'm not a skeptic, not even remotely as skeptical as the mainstream of science is. But I do think we need to be skeptical, because the fact, natural selection, it doesn't select, the mechanism doesn't work at the level of the individual, it works at the level of the species. So, anything that enhances the survival and reproductive fitness of a species is going to be selected in. It doesn't require a conscious decision by the mother plant oh gosh, I'm feeling broody about my little ones. I better quickly share some of the good stuff to help them. It's not required for that mechanism to have evolved. So the observation that you've just made, interesting as it is, I don't think that it requires feeling on the part of the plant. If you found a situation where the plant had to decide, should it be me or should it be my little ones? Well, under these circumstances, I've learned that the best thing to do is to save myself first, and then later that'll enable me to do blah blah blah. That's the kind of thing consciousness enables us to make these choices. And unless you can demonstrate behavior by the plant, which is not entirely predictable on the basis of a pre-existing mechanism, I don't see why consciousness is required. I don't see what consciousness adds to what the plant is doing reflexively. But I will end where I began and remind you that if you show me the slightest little jot of evidence that plants are conscious, I'll say, great, the more the merrier. I'm not a chauvinist when it comes to consciousness. I'm not trying to keep it to ourselves, but I don't want to become a panpsychist who says, well, everything is conscious. I don't believe everything is conscious. What we understand of the mechanisms implies that it performs a specific function, and not everything in the universe has that functional capacity. I hope plants are conscious, but I don't think they are.
Yeah, so to make sure that, if we want to prove that plants are conscious, then we have to actually show that that is the other way around. So one thing is the mother plant is deciding whether or not to share its resources with its own children, right?
Yeah, that doesn't have to be limited to the one example you've just given, because there's a lot of, you will know this as well as anybody. You'll know this better than anybody probably in this audience, certainly better than me. But you film plant behavior, just speed up the film. It's incredible what they do. It's really incredible, and they look like animals. If you just
exactly, absolutely, yeah.
And they're striving for things. It's remarkable. All I'm saying is not only about this example you're giving. I'm saying in plant behavior altogether, if you can show evidence that the plant is faced with uncertainty and then has to use trial and error, as to is this working or isn't this working, changes its mind and comes up with a solution that is not that is of its own making on the basis of its own experience, that would be compelling evidence that the plant has feelings, because that's the function of feelings. The function of feelings is precisely to enable the organism to make choices in uncertain circumstances, literally feel its way through a problem. This is what trial and error is. And I say again, I'm ready to be persuaded plants can do that. I'm not aware of any evidence that they do. But if they do, I'll be the first one to say, well, why isn't that consciousness? Some very simple form. Of course, we must also remember, this goes back to Anna's first question. This word consciousness means different things to different people. The way in which I'm using the term is in this absolutely most elementary form. In other words, there is something it is like to be the plant. There's something it's like for the plant to be a plant. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.
So if this really happens, and if you find out plants are conscious, then probably it would be a nightmare for all the vegetarians. Kavya also has an
Yeah, so it was a wonderful talk. So this is a question continuation with my question regarding the dream state. So so if the eye region in the wakeful state is different from the eye-ness in the dream state, so in the person who is with the damaged region of that consciousness is still able to um, uh, dream, and he is still to some extent alive in the conscious state, in the dream state, if these two regions are different in the brainstem.
Yes. So let me just first of all address this question about I, that you said at the beginning. Just as I said earlier, that consciousness admits of degrees of complexity, so too does the concept of a self, a subject. The fish that just feels pain doesn't have an idea of itself. It just has a self, its selfhood is constituted simply of its feelings, of its own state. But you and I have this concept, this word, me, which is very different. And then this me, the agent of the mind, sometimes is in charge of our behavior and sometimes not. Dreams are an example of where we are not really in charge, except for those rare things called lucid dreams. In most dreams, the dream just happens to us. So the dreaming brain is degraded in terms of its selfhood, in terms of the complexity of what we mean by I, and that correlates anatomically with prefrontal cortical activation. The prefrontal cortex is deactivated during dreaming sleep, but it's highly activated during waking cognition. And by the way, patients who have damage to the prefrontal cortex, their dreams are the same as yours and mine. I did a study of that. Blind raters can't differentiate the dreams of prefrontal patients and normal people. So that's the thing about the I. I just want to be sure that we've addressed that point of what we mean by I. Now, you say the patients who have damage to that part who still dream, I presume you mean the mesopontine tegmentum, the part that generates the REM sleep. Patients with damage to the mesopontine tegmentum who don't have REM sleep and who do dream, certainly there's an I there, in the sense that there is for you and me. There's an affective experiencing being in the dream. But I have to add to that most patients, so the region that generates REM sleep, the mesopontine tegmentum, is very close to the parabrachial complex. And if you have damage in the parabrachial complex, you're in a coma. So, it's actually a small number of patients who have such highly precise lesions that they lose REM sleep and their consciousness is preserved. I have collected a sample of 18 patients like that, which is not a large number. So I just needed to add the footnote that the majority of patients with loss of REM sleep have also got a loss of consciousness. And that's because the part of the brain that we're talking about is really just millimeters apart. The part that generates REM sleep and the parabrachial complex are right next to each other. So most patients who don't have REM sleep don't have any consciousness, and therefore I'm sure they don't dream either. But the fact that there are 18 who are conscious enough to report on their mental states, they report the experience of selfhood in sleep. In other words, a dream experience.
So, so my question was like, have you come across any patients who have lost that region which represents a consciousness in the wakeful state, and not the region which is active during the sleep state or the dream state?
No,
So that
there's no patient that I'm aware of ever described who's not conscious during the day and yet has dreams at night. But it would also be very hard to, I mean, how would such a patient report to you that they have dreams if the only consciousness they have is when they're asleep, and that in waking cognition there's no consciousness. So there is no such patient that's been reported, but it's also both empirically and sort of philosophically not a surprise that no such patient has been reported. But I don't want to be pedantic. I'll come at your question in a different way, basically just by saying this. The brain mechanisms of consciousness seem to be one and the same, in sleep and in waking. The basic mechanisms that generate consciousness, whether you're asleep or you're awake, are the reticular activating system and periaqueductal gray, and they are, all of those structures are highly implicated in both types of consciousness, that is to say, dream consciousness and waking consciousness.
okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
We can actually reverse the situation. So what happens in insomnia, like the people who have insomnia? Do they?
Well, first of all, insomnia there are many different mechanisms whereby insomnia arises. And very few insomniac patients is it due to a neurological disorder. The vast majority of insomnias, have to do with other difficulties. But there are some neurological diseases which cause insomnia, and some of them are genetic, and they are all of them horrible. I'll tell you what the outcome is. They die. Fatal familial insomnia is called fatal for a very good reason. You cannot survive without sleep. So if you're literally insomniac in the sense that you do not have any sleep, you die. And remember what I said about the categorical variables earlier. We have multiple needs. We've got to meet them all. You can't skip any of them out. One of our needs is we need to sleep. If you don't sleep, you're gone.
Exactly. Okay, so there is next question from Neha.
Hello, Mark. Thank you. Thank
Hello.
you so much for the talk. I think one question has already been asked. It was related to these sleep cycles and like how sleep cycles affect the conscious state of a person. But I think you already have answered about it. And my next question is about, like, as you describe consciousness and feelings and everything. So is a state of consciousness is continuous and these experiences are homogeneous, or like how?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm understanding you correctly, so I'll answer you, and then if I haven't answered what you intended to ask, then just say so.
Okay.
First of all, consciousness is not continuous precisely in the sense that we go to sleep, and not all of sleep is, we're only conscious during dreaming sleep. During slow wave sleep, for most of like deep sleep, you're not there. So you know that from your own experience. You go to sleep at night and then you wake up again. So I'm back again. You weren't there in the interim. You were asleep. Mm-hmm. So it's not continuous in that sense. However, I'll tell you two interesting things. The one is that certainly you experience when you're awake. You experience your consciousness as a stream, as a continuous flow. But when you remember episodically. We call it episodic memory, the memory of experience. If you remember what you did yesterday, I mean, if you just do it now in your privacy of your own mind, you'll find you've got these discrete episodes. We have these little snapshots, and we actually forget an alarming amount of what happened. So certainly the consciousness of that we lay down in our memory is highly discontinuous. We have snapshot episodes. To that, I will add this, that I think that our actual here and now conscious experience is more like those snapshots than we like to believe. I think that we are actually having little discrete episodes of consciousness all the time. And there's a lot more darting about and a lot more discontinuity. And we kind of smooth over those lines of fracture in the way that we, in the sort of the way that we, in the immediate wake of an experience, we weave them all together. But I think that each experience is much more discrete than we think it is. But I don't know if that's what you have in mind when you ask me, is consciousness continuous or not?
Yes, it was exactly this. Like, because as you also described that 95% of the times we register things unconsciously.
Yes.
So, but they still come in bits and pieces as a memory.
Yes.
So like that thing, can we call that memory, like that recalling that memory being conscious state? So like it's continuously conscious, we are registering, even if we are registering like unconsciously,
yeah,
but it comes to us.
So that kind of memory, we call it declarative memory, and episodic memory is a category of declarative memory. And what that word means is simply conscious memory. It's memory that is capable of consciousness. So yes, we certainly include that kind of experience under the heading of consciousness, you know, the episodic remembering. A lot of what is going on in your mind consciously at any point in time is in the form of thought. You know, it's not just perceptual here and now experience. It's also, oh, this is like that, or now I'm going to do this, or this reminds me of that, or, you know, etc. So our consciousness is not just made up of a stream of perception, it's made up of perception interpreted by memory all the time in multiple different ways. But what I was referring to when I say that I think even our perceptual experience is a series of snapshots. It's linked to, when you said this thing about 95%, let me clarify that. I don't mean that, you know, that you are perceiving 5% of what's going on and 95% you're not. The studies that Baj and Chartrand reviewed, they showed the decision, the things, the goal-directed activity. 95% of the variance is explained by things that the person wasn't aware was what led them to the outcome that they were led to. So I'm talking about something slightly different from that. When I say that I think that perceptual experience is much more discontinuous than we like to believe, it's because the mechanism, perception, you must remember, is unconscious. So, you know, what makes us become conscious of, and what makes us become conscious is salient uncertainty. So, you know, we're quite happy to not be conscious of what we're perceiving, as long as what we predicted would happen is what's happening. So there's an enormous amount of it's kind of data compression, I suppose, is a way to put it. Think about the metabolic cost of processing everything that happens as if, you know, it's as if you couldn't predict 95% of it and don't need to process it. You know, so you only process that which is not expected. So there alone you have a basis for conscious experience being highly discontinuous, because most of even just our perception, most of that is happening unconsciously, in the sense that as long that we have a prediction of what we expect is going to happen based on past experience, as long as that is how the world works, you're not surprised by it, and you just carry on. But the bits that do not fit in with what you expected, that's where you need to make choices. You don't have an automatized response, and so you have and there's a lot of uncertainty in the world. So there's a lot that's happening, and so you don't attend to all of it because there's an action bottleneck. You can't do everything at once. Mm-hmm. So you can unconsciously, you have multiple parallel processing streams unconsciously, but once it comes to consciousness, it's a very limited resource. Cognitive consciousness is a very small place. And so, you have to also select from all the uncertainty, what is the salient uncertainty? And it's on the basis of mechanistic arguments like that, that I make the point that our consciousness is much less continuous than we think it is. But then I invite you to do what I do, which is really not science. It's just sort of interesting anecdotal evidence. I've tried, in the light of the sort of arguments I've just given you, to monitor closely my experience, and what is it and I'll give you an example that happened to me yesterday here in Berlin. I was sitting here. I'm in an apartment. I was on the 3rd floor of a building. I was looking out over the what do you call that area outside? The balcony, and I suddenly saw this bird consciously. I mean, there are birds flying around all the time. Why did I see that bird? It was standing on an electric wire, and I suddenly saw that bird. And the reason I saw it was at the very moment that bird opened its mouth, a dog barked. So I saw a bird barking, and I thought, shit, a barking bird. That's what made me conscious of it, because it was behaving in a way that was most unexpected for a bird. And so if you monitor your own conscious experience and have a look at what did you become aware of, and also think back over the last minute, what was I doing? So actually I was just thinking, but I was moving around doing all sorts of things, but I don't remember seeing anything. I was all inside my head, etc.
Yes, this is very true. Like most of the times we are in our own thoughts.
That's right. Yes. It's alarming actually how little we are conscious of what's going on around us most of the time. But the reassuring counter argument is the reason we're not aware of it is because we predict it and it's functioning according to our predictions, and therefore there's no need to attend to it.
Okay. That's very interesting. Thank you for answering the questions. But at the end, I would like to mention that I'm also a plant biologist. So when you were discussing about this consciousness and all that, I'm like, I also would be happy if I come across evidences that plants are also conscious. But I would just like to add onto that, because I work with plants, mutants, that are insufficient in producing seeds, the offsprings. So according to those observations and other observations also, that plants are aware of their environment. I can strongly comment on that. If there is a plant who has, let's say we call it control, it produced certain amount of seeds and it says like, okay, now I'm done and I'm dying. On the other hand, the plant which is not able to produce enough seeds, it is aware that I'm not able to reproduce. And it keeps on attempting, these events, fertilization events, to produce seeds, unless and until like they grow till, I don't know, twice time than the control plants. So based on that, I do feel that plants are aware of their environment, and like especially these things that they have to reproduce and leave their offsprings.
Well, so that's again, it's very interesting, and I'll repeat what I said earlier. I'm not prejudiced against the possibility that plants are conscious. I just want to see evidence of the kind that I mentioned earlier. Namely, I want to see the plant making choices, and behaving therefore voluntarily. I think what you've just described, it's much the same as the earlier example about the plant nourishing its offspring. You can easily imagine a mechanism the enormous selection pressure on reproductive success. If the plant is not succeeding in reproducing, then it's failing in one of its major sort of the major mechanisms that gave rise to the design of plants, like the design of all living things. So I can imagine that there's no choice required there. It's just you're not reproducing, so do more, do more, do more. Could easily be a very basic reflexive mechanism. When you say the plant is aware of its environment, I think that goes under the heading of what we were saying earlier about what we were discussing earlier about sensory mechanisms. Sensory mechanisms do not imply awareness. They imply, some sort of receptor that responds to some sort of stimulus. It doesn't require. We know that, in creatures like ourselves who are conscious and can report on our conscious states, we know that they are, like I just told you about the experiment with the faces and the words. That's sensation, if there ever was, a very complicated form of information processing about the state of the environment around us without any awareness. So for me, awareness has to do with something other than sensation.
Okay, interesting. No, good to know, because if ever we also think related to plant consciousness, then it is important, because for us, these responding to this environmental signals, sensing these signals, and you can see the subtle changes happening at the molecular level. Yes. It's like they are aware of what is being happened to them.
Yeah, it's as if they were aware, but it doesn't mean they are, and it doesn't mean they aren't. I wouldn't be surprised if ultimately science comes to the conclusion that all living things have some rudimentary form of consciousness. I wouldn't be surprised. It's possible, but at this point in time, I'm just repeating myself when I say I'm certain about vertebrates. I think it very likely that insects and cephalopods are conscious. The rest, I'm just not sure. I'm not saying they're not. I'm just not sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so since we have quite, the information-hungry audience, there is one more question, and then we can close the session. So the question is Freud. It's from Harry. Freud believed that the unconscious mind could still have an influence on our behavior. So how you define unconscious mind, and how does it affect the behavior?
So there are many unconscious mechanisms that influence our behavior, including reflexes, as I said earlier. So I don't want to limit what I'm about to say. I don't think that the only unconscious mechanisms are the ones I'm about to mention, but the ones that Freud had in mind, when he speaks of the unconscious mind, what he's referring to is not reflexes, are not sort of autonomic vegetative processes. So the question is, what does he mean by mind? What makes something mental? Because as we've just been learning in relation to plants, there's certainly goal-directed behavior without any mind necessarily being there. So my way of defining a mind, you may be surprised to learn, because I'm a psychoanalyst, my way of defining a mind is something that's capable of consciousness. That it's not the only thing. I mean, I think minds have four fundamental properties. Number one, they're subjective, but not everything that is subjective is mental. Number two, they're capable of consciousness. Number three, they're intentional. And number four, they have agency. In other words, they have choice, this thing I was just talking about. But within that set of criteria, I'm focusing on the one that they're capable of consciousness. In other words, a person in a coma doesn't have a mind, because they're not capable of consciousness. Now, when Freud says the unconscious mind, what does he mean? I think he means intentional, subjective, agental states which do not have consciousness attached to them. And the majority of those, and this is why I said at the beginning, I'm not limiting it to this, but the majority of those were once conscious. In other words, I told you that you feel your way through life's problems, and then you learn from experience. Once you've learned, so you have to feel your way into an uncertain situation, a novel situation. Is this working? Is this not working? Feeling determines your choices. Once you've made successful choice and survived, the problem, solved the problem, then the next time you're in that same situation, you don't need to feel your way through it again, because you've solved that problem. So there isn't uncertainty the next time. So you have a prediction which you then execute. It's only if that prediction doesn't work that you have this uncertainty. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, as long as your predictions are coming to pass, you don't need to be aware of the sensory signals. You only need to be aware of the prediction errors, and a subset of sensory signals get propagated inwards. Those are the ones that we process because those are the ones that demand attention. That is to say, they demand consciousness. So once you've acted, once you've solved a problem, and then you are no longer conscious of what you're doing, I think that's a mental act, because it was once a conscious state. It's now an unconscious state. It's driving your behavior, on the basis of past experience. And so the unconscious mind, for me, for the most part, refers to that kind of thing. Responses which have become automatized. Now, unfortunately, many responses become automatized in childhood, which are not the best solutions you can come up with in adulthood. But that's too late, because now they're automatized. So that I think describes a hell of a lot of what Freud was interested in. Automatized predictions, which were automatized at a point that the child could come up with nothing better. So we have childish ways of behaving in a kind of stereotyped way in relation to situations which, if we were not relying on unconscious predictions, we would be able to come up with much better, more mature, more realistic, more flexible solutions. So that's kind of in a nutshell how I understand what Freud calls unconscious mental processes. They automatized, once were conscious choices, and now are conscious choices no longer, and they just happen through us and to us, and we're no longer in charge of them. We being the conscious mind.
Exactly. And when we are talking about the unconscious mind, there is one more question from Sarah, and she asks about when the consciousness starts in the human babies, like during the gestation period between 25 to 28 weeks, for example, and yes. How because there is a lot of this transfer of nutrients from mother, right? So if that affects consciousness.
Yes. So I have two. I'm glad this is the last question, because I've got to go in a minute. So I have two answers to that question. The one is that the periaqueductal gray, which I haven't spoken enough about, it's the part of the brain stem that is most important for feeling. And it's a very primitive, very ancient structure, the periaqueductal gray. We know when it comes into, when it starts to function in rodents, there's no study of the, there's no study at all of, and you can imagine the reasons why. Nobody has studied what happens in the periaqueductal gray of the human fetus in vivo. But if we extrapolate from the rodent data, in other words, if we take their gestation period and map it onto our gestation, which is a very rough and ready way of doing it, then it seems it's around 8 weeks or so that the periaqueductal gray in human gestation comes into activity. That's the first answer to the question. The second answer to the question is, just because it's active doesn't mean you're feeling anything. And the reason I say that is because what activate the periaqueductal gray is where all the body's homeostats, the residual error signal descends upon the periaqueductal gray. The periaqueductal gray is a great convergence site of all homeostatic error signals. Now, the interesting thing about intrauterine existence is that you're very unlikely to have homeostatic error signals, because that's the whole point. That all of your bodily functions are being supported by the mother's bodily functions. The whole business of the placenta and not only the placenta, the whole facilitating environment for the prenatal fetus, I think suggests that it starts to experience things a hell of a lot later. Once unpredictable things start happening, where it needs to, the fetus has uncertainty about what the hell is this and what am I to do. Certainly, we see voluntary behavior in fetuses, but a hell of a lot later than 8 weeks. So it's a very difficult question to answer. But I would say that the possibility exists around 8 weeks or so, if we use rats as an example, that the PAG is functional. The possibility that it is actually processing and prioritizing error signals, I think much more likely in the 3rd trimester, much later. But that's a guess.
Yeah, sure. It's a fair guess, I think. So final words. What do you think about consciousness, if we can artificially generate it? And if people want to read more about your work, where they can find more information.
So I really do have to go. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The short answer to that question, those 2 questions. Number one, I believe. Well, Richard Feynman, the great physicist, Richard Feynman, when he died, it was written on his blackboard. I don't want to say they were his last words, because we don't know when he wrote it on his blackboard. But what was found on his blackboard, he said, if I can't create it, I don't understand it. And I believe in that. So I say that if we're claiming that the causal mechanism of consciousness is the mechanism I've described, in other words, an extended form of homeostasis, then you should be able to engineer it. So I think it is possible that it's plausible that we could engineer an artificial consciousness in the form of let us say, a machine whose purpose is to continue existing, and which has needs like energy needs and temperature regulation needs and so on, which it registers. It registers its own needs in the form of artificial affects. I think that's possible. Moreover, I think that if we can't do that, then we haven't solved the problem of consciousness, because if you can't engineer it, you don't understand it. So that may make you think I'm crazy. I'm very surprised to hear myself saying it when I first said it, but I'm driven to the conclusion that it must be possible, if we understand the basic mechanism, to engineer it, an artificial form of a self-organizing system which feels its own states of these rudimentary kinds. The question about where can we read more? Well, the best place to read is my book, because that's where I give the fullest account of all of this stuff. My book's called The Hidden Spring. It has the subtitle, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. If you don't have access to that, then and you want an open access online article, which covers much the same territory, I wrote a paper called The Hard Problem and the Free Energy Principle. It's in one of the Frontiers journals. I can't remember which one, but if you Google my surname, Frontiers and Hard Problem, the article will come up, and it's freely available. So that's a good sort of overview of my views, but it's obviously condensed into a journal article. a fuller version is my book.
Yes, and people should certainly buy this book and read it. So thank you so much for the great session, and
Thanks.
thank you for sharing your views. Yes.
Thanks for the conversation. I enjoyed it.
Bye.
And I hope that some of you will discover plant consciousness. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Good night.
Bye. Bye.